ahead.
Hello, I'm Alvin, Alexis, Currier. My name, my baptismal name was Alvin. And my father was a numerologist, and he looked for a name that had a perfect power number. I don't know anything about numerology, but he came up with Alvin. All I know is, I don't know about numerology, all I know is it's a chipmunk. But anyhow, I'm Alvin Currier, and in our travels, especially in the Orthodox world, after our entrance into the Orthodox Church, we had taken the name of Alexis as a second name. So in much of Eastern Europe, or actually in many circles, I'm known now basically as Alexis Currier.
So how did you come to reside in the Cumberland area?
Oh, how did I come to reside in Cumberland? Well, that's the short end of a long story. My wife, Anastasia, grew up in Bruce, but she raised her family in Menominee. And so when we moved to Mexico, this is jumping around a bit, when we moved to Mexico in 2003, where we lived for 5 years, in the summer we would come up here. It's the other way around, you know. In the winter, from here you go to Mexico, but in Mexico you come up here for the summer. And her daughter had a camper out at Country Quiet, out on Highway B. And so we used to come up there in the summer, and then we finally bought a camper. So we had the best of two worlds. We came up here for the summer, and we spent the winter in Mexico. That all ended in 2008 when open heart surgery took a big bite out of our income, or our stash, or whatever you want to call it. And we moved up here, and then we sought out an apartment in Lakeview Apartments. And in 2008, we moved into the apartment, and we've lived there ever since, 13 years. We call it our hobbit hole. It's actually the smallest apartment in the complex. And the rumor is that when we moved in, the other residents said, "Oh my goodness, they're moving into the smallest apartment. Either they love each other or they're going to kill each other." But so far, we're still very much in love and have become very much at home in Cumberland.
Why is storytelling so important to you?
Oh, well, I think storytelling is not an end in itself. It's a byproduct of what I would call my insatiable curiosity. And I think this is the key, if I might choose one, to my particular personality. And that is that I want to know what's behind the door, behind the picture, around the corner, or anything like that. Wait a minute, I'm already lost the question. I got off on the answer.
Why storytelling is so important?
Storytelling, yes. I was born with an insatiable curiosity. I was not an athlete as a young boy. I was that odd kid on the schoolyard who was the last to get picked for the baseball team because he was so awkward. He could never hit the ball or run in football. But he had other talents that God had given him. And so I grew up with an insatiable curiosity, and I think that's demonstrated when I was in college. I'd grown up in the Methodist Church, and I became curious about Roman Catholics, although then we only said, or I only said, Catholics. And so one day when I was in college, mind you, I was already graduated from high school, I was in college, but I'd never been in a Catholic church. And we were driving, we had a 47 Studebaker, and we were out cruising as kids do. I think it was first year of college. And we were in Stillwater, and I was overwhelmed with curiosity. And so with a pounding heart and great fear, I went exploring in the Stillwater Catholic Church with great big statues and all sorts of a strange smell from incense or something. And that was the beginning. I've been snooping around for the 50 years that followed.
Well, you have such a rich knowledge of Finnish, Polish, Russian folklore, and your illustrations are so beautiful. Talk a little bit about some of your illustrations in your books, and were they all from people that you knew, or was some of it right from your imagination?
Well, no, none of it was from my imagination. As I said before, I had this insatiable curiosity. When I went away to theological seminary, I graduated from McAllister College in St. Paul. Then I went away to theological seminary at Union Theological Seminary in New York. I was taken as a candidate for the Presbyterian ministry. And our first year, I was married then in 1952, and we went east to theological seminary. And there, a young couple came on when we were junior students. We were the new students. I say we because I was married at that time. And there was an evening, a couple came and talked about they had done their middle year. A theological education is 3 years, and so they had done their middle year at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Well, insatiable curiosity. This just sounded like the most amazing thing that could ever happen. And my parents were not wealthy, but they were very comfortable. I was born when they were in their 40s, so I was a little, and they hadn't had a boy, and so I was, as my auntie said, you were a spoiled brat. But anyhow, I was tempted to go to study in Scotland. Well, it came true. And on September 4th, 1954, I think it was, we boarded the Cunard Line ship, the Mauritania, one of the grand old transatlantic steamers with 3 classes, first class, class, and then steerage down below. That's where we were. In those days, I think a lot of people don't realize, especially young people, you didn't flit across the Atlantic in in 8 hours from O'Hare to Frankfurt. We sailed 11 days. This was a majestic experience. And we went. Then Catherine was born, my daughter. She was with us, and we went to I studied at St. Mary's College, which was the theological college in the English university system. University is made up of many different faculties, and each faculty has its own building or college. And so I was at the St. Mary's faculty, the theological faculty of the University of St. Andrews. I even studied some theology, but most of the time, this bug of insatiable curiosity. So the first thing I did was to acquire a proper Scottish accent. And I was amazed by the folks that came to the school, and they were speaking a language that I couldn't understand. That was very difficult. Silly lad, but I was having a wonderful time. We toured all of Scotland, we climbed mountains, and it didn't hurt my theological growth because I was meeting people, I was learning the development of a culture, the struggle between the clans and between the aristocracy and the peasantry, the agricultural cycle. I loved Scotland, fell in love with it, bought a second-hand regimental Black Watch battalion kilt, and came home being a Scottish boy. I don't know, that's just the beginning. I graduated from, I don't know how far I go with this question. Graduated from Theological Seminary in New York City in 1956, and having grown up in South Minneapolis and gone to Macalester College in St. Paul, by this time, and this was partly from Scotland, I had a part of me that was fascinated by the people of the land. So my mother's family came from South Dakota, Parker, South Dakota, Turner County, south of Sioux Falls. And I was fascinated by people who lived close to the earth. In Scotland, you might call them the peasantry, or I don't think that's a Scottish term, but that's a term I would use. And so after 3 years in New York, I was ordained in 1956 in Westminster Church of Minneapolis to the gospel ministry in the Presbyterian Church. And I went to serve with a colleague of mine who graduated. We served 3 churches with 2 pastors. This was what the church was doing at that time, how to keep small rural congregations solvent. And so I moved out, and then on and off over the next 5 years, I served in the churches of Gilman. No, wait a minute, now I'm jumping ahead. I served in, I'm missing the town. Mountain Lake, Minnesota, Alpha, Minnesota. There was another town slipping me. 3 churches. We were a young family. That was a young congregation. Mountain Lake is a town that was settled by Mennonites. And here comes this curse of insatiable curiosity. Who are Mennonites? There were 12 Mennonite churches in the circle around Mountain Lake, and the Presbyterian Church was founded there, and they used to, the members of the congregation used to call themselves the Church of the Disgruntled Mennonites. So I was pastor to the disgruntled Mennonite. And I became, again, it's hard to say this because it's a compliment I receive. I started studying the Mennonites and was fascinated by these people and their traditions and why there was 12 churches, and how they had migrated from Holland to the Vistula River Delta of Poland, from Poland to the great fields of the Ukraine, invited when the Cossacks drove the Mongols out, and the farmland opened up. Empress Catherine the Great needed farmers, and she wanted these industrial Mennonite farmers. So the compliment that came after 2 years was Professor Wiebe of Bethel College, which was the big Bethel College in Kansas. He gave his kids in the class an assignment when they went home for Christmas, and he told them that to write the history of the settlement of their community. And he said, and if you come from Mountain Lake, don't go to any of your Mennonite pastors. If you really want to find out what happened, go to the Presbyterian pastor. Now, I wore that as a badge of love and compliment. I'm rambling now. Do you want to pull me back on schedule?
Yeah. So you have a love of learning and this curiosity. How did that end up becoming illustrations and stories that you had published?
Well, I swiftly, the first writing actually, I've got to go into I was in Mountain Lake, Minnesota. In Mountain Lake, Minnesota, then an old friend, again, a long story, the short version is, a German theological student met an American girl, they married. He had a church in Germany. When I was studying in Scotland, I traveled to Germany and we visited him. And when I was ordained and in Mountain Lake, he wrote that in those days you could only travel across the Atlantic with a ship. And so there was no coming over for him to bring his American wife back to visit the American grandparents unless they took a ship and were gone for a month or so. Well, you can't leave the parish for a month. So he suggested an exchange. And I was interested. I would go to Germany as an exchange pastor. And he said he went to ask the bishop in Karlsruhe, and the bishop said, fine, that's fine with me. Just two conditions. First, you must, let's see. No, the congregation, the German congregation, they must approve of it, and the American must speak fluent German. So he wrote back to me, I'll take care of the congregation, you learn German. So I studied with an old Mennonite the Mennonites, most of them the old ones spoke German. And so I studied. She spoke German, like all languages, has many levels. She spoke a very aristocratic German. Sie hat mit einem ausgezeichneten Hochdeutsch-Akzent gesprochen. She had with a very exceptional high-class German accent she spoke. Okay. Anyhow, I went to Germany, and now I've lost the train of getting that. Then somehow I got to end up in Finland, but help me along now.
So you're in Europe now. How do you transition from just this occasional work that you're doing in Europe to, I think you led tours, did you, to?
That comes much later. Okay. Again, we're the sequence. I'm an exchange pastor, 1959 and 60. I come back to the United States. I'm in the parish in Mountain Lake, Minnesota. How did that go? Yeah, I lost track of my own, my own.
So after being in Minnesota, where was your next call as a pastor?
You know, actually I went, after the exchange pastorate, I went back to Germany to study. And I landed in Berlin. And that's where, okay, then we're going to move. If we want to get to Finland, I was in Berlin. I had a lot of contacts, again, insatiable curiosity. I wrote a book that was finally published about 5 years later. It was my only thick book, and I don't have a copy of it here. And in those years, I lived in Berlin and studied the Christian Marxist dialogue and went back and forth. Now we're talking about the years of up to 1963. So 60 to 61 to 63 in Berlin at the Free University of Berlin. And that's where I made a lot of contacts. I can't jump to Finland without, then we came back in 1964, and I was hired as in the chaplain's office of Macalester College in St. Paul, a very solid, well-known, established institution. And for the next 11 years, I was in the chaplain's office of Macalester College. Finally, from being assistant chaplain, I was the chaplain of the college. And in those years, then I would travel, if I could, with almost every summer to Europe. And there it was in 1972, I was at the European Student Pastors Conference, and I met Lauri Verkunen, who was the campus pastor at the University of Helsinki, and his wife, Annu Verkunen, and they invited me. Finns they love their country and they want to show everyone paradise. And they invited me, and of course, insatiable curiosity, ding, I went to Finland. And in 1974, then, again, the summer, I was chaplain at Macalester. We were living in St. Paul. I traveled back to Finland to visit them. And that's where I really got interested in Finland. Now we're talking about 1974. This book was published in 1974, 79. In other words, I spent every summer going back and forth to Finland. Why? Again, insatiable curiosity. And when I met Anu, and she said, come to our summer home, which was the old family farm way up in the lakes. I went up into the lakes, into the lake country, and almost the first day we were walking, she was walking me around in the fields and down by the sauna and down by the lake, and she told me this, we saw a bird. Nothing spectacular there, but she said, you know, in Finland, birds are messengers. Oh, bong, curiosity. And then she told me the story that in Finnish culture, when a child dies, the child comes back during the 9 days following the death. The child returns to the family as a bird, and it lights on the shoulder of all of the siblings. And then there was a strange comment, except if there's a sibling where there is a tension or animosity, then the bird doesn't land on the shoulder of that person. And she told a story of the neighboring farm where the boy died and the bird came back and it landed on everyone except the brother with whom he always fought. And this, again, insatiable curiosity. Where does this come from in a culture? And so I began to discover, and then I discovered that Finnish culture is how do you say, transferred from generation to generation, not by writing, but by singing. Wow, this just blew my mind. And then all of a sudden it opened up the vast literature of the songs or the song singers at the Kalevala. There was a whole history that was sung and memorized by people who were song singers. What is fascinating here to me is that Finland had its own language, and they had this vast reservoir of songs, but they weren't written down. They were in the memory of people. So Finland was part of Russia, and then it was part of Sweden. In fact, Finland became a Grand Duchy of Sweden in the early 1800s, but in 1860, the parliament in Sweden, or in Finland, discussed a bill. All the discussion was in Swedish. All of the intelligentsia was Swedish, and people had to take Swedish names. But it fascinates me that when the Finnish parliament was arguing whether to adopt Finnish as the national language in 1850, mind you, not so long ago, the whole argument, the whole debate was carried on in Swedish. So Finland, in discovering itself from 1850 on, began to discover their heritage of the sung songs or the song singers. There is a doctor, Lönnrot, who traveled extensively in the backwoods and collected these stories. And that's the background that finally came into this book about Currier and the song singers. Again, insatiable curiosity. And I became fascinated. There were laments, and in Finland it was, in fact, one of the pictures that, for me, I don't know whether you can see it, is a lamenting woman. These I suppose in a crude translation they'd be called witches, but they were spiritual women, and they would come and sing for the spirit to the spirits and lament at the grave. And obviously I became interested in writing about this, and because I was self-publishing, I wasn't a graduate of any faculty, I didn't have any grant or anything. I was just a curious person. So I published it myself, so I started drawing pictures, and I illustrated the whole book. And that's where I discovered that I could draw. And that was the beginning of the drawing. Now I've lost track of where I'm rambling.
Oh, perfect. Of the other books that you have there with you, what would you particularly like to show us, and how it relates, like your illustrations, to the story? Because when you look at your books, the folklore comes alive. You know, people can relate, they can understand it more. Which one is your favorite, or what would you like to share with us about other books that you've written?
Probably this one is most important. It's called Grandma's Ritual Towels. But what a ritual towel is that's a longer story. I'll skip it. But cloth was very precious, and I became fascinated with the history of cloth. When I came to the Romanian village, if we fast forward, we're going to get, in the Romanian village, we're going to find people still, just 40 years ago, still wearing homespun. They had two pieces of clothing. They had their daily work clothes, and then they had clothes that were made basically on the same linen or hemp, but were embroidered and made fancy. These were the Sunday or the festival clothes. And then there wasn't anything like paper, but you could take, cloth was precious, terribly precious. And if you wanted to send a wish to somebody, a card, we would do it today with a card. You took a piece of cloth and you embroidered. If it was for a marriage and a bride, you embroidered fertility symbols on the long cloth, and that would become sort of like we would send a card. They sent a towel. A towel was a minimum piece of cloth required, and then it was embroidered. And so I wanted to explain this and how cloth was made, and so I started writing the book, and I let's see. As you can see, I'm an old man, but when my grandmother smiled at me, then softly said, "Come here, my dear. It's time to hear the story the towel can tell us." And she led me then to her cluttered room, her sanctuary, she called it. And stretching up on her tippy toes, she reached the icon on the wall and slipped the towel from it. And so I went on to say, they didn't go to the store to buy clothes. They made them from how they sowed seed, and a teaching tool. Again, struggling at this point and still to make people aware of how culture developed. Now, there's no thought given. You go to the store and you buy it. But it was almost in my lifetime. I'm going to be 90 in a couple of months. In my lifetime, there were vast stretches of the globe where cloth was made by starting from a seed, going through the whole process. And I wanted to share that. That's the birth of the story, and also the birth of the history.
I don't think you probably started your career knowing you were going to be a writer, an illustrator. You studied in a different, area. So what tips or what words of wisdom would you like to give to people of any age about writing, about preserving the story that they may have inside of them or that they're curious about?
Oh, of course, we're sitting in a library, so we're already tipping the scale a little bit. Yes, write it down, tell it, record it, take photos and leave them. Such amazing stories. The background of one of the Christmas stories I wrote, well, we finally found our spiritual home in the Eastern tradition, while the Eastern tradition communicated much more by ritual and acts and theater and music. It used the six senses rather than the intellectual verbalism of the Protestant tradition that I started out in. Catholicism has a rich traditional heritage, but to write or keep alive these traditions, keep my daughter, 67 now, she said, you know, Dad, that when we were kids and it was Christmas Eve and we came in and all those gifts were under the tree, but we had to sit still while you read the Bible. That was the worst thing. That was the worst thing. We couldn't wait. Why you had to do that? But now, she said, now I long for that ritual. Well, I guess that is self-explanatory what that means. Just keep the rituals alive. Keep the songs.
You said that you didn't have formal training in art school or drawing.
Never.
Do you have any other advice about drawing? You know, I've read that anybody can draw. You just need to practice, practice, practice. You train your eyes to see and you draw. How did you get to be so good? Your illustrations are beautiful.
That's a new concept, and I have to digest it. I'm thinking drawing is one way. You have six senses. I can't process it all right now. I need to. I once asked, or I heard this story. I wasn't mine, but it's a good story. A person who was exploring the Orthodox Church asked a priest and a question, and the priest answered, "We'll have to see what the church sings about that and paints about that." Singing, the liturgy, and the iconography. And I somehow I think that all of the six senses are important, and you may be strong in one or another, but the one that you're strong in that's your particular gift to the community.
Great.
Does that hit it? Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to talk about, a particular story or an experience of publishing a book or one of your travels?
No, it's framing and telling a story is also a gift, and I wrote a book. This is just a book about the early experiences in Romania, Shadows of Yesterday, and it's full of stories. But what I want to do is to urge people to go back into their own history. When I came to the little Orthodox church here in Clayton, Wisconsin, I walked in and I said, well, where did these settlers come from? Oh, they came from Czechoslovakia, they came from Europe, they came from the Carpathian Mountains. But where? Oh, I don't know. Now if they come to church and ask where they come from, they say, go to Alexis, he knows all that stuff. But anyhow, the story, I've always encouraged people to go back into your history, into your fair. And there's a story when I was chaplain at McAllister, there was a good one to end with. There was a young woman who came to me and she said, Chaplain, I'm going back to Greece because my grandparents came from Greece. But my folks, what should I do? I want to go back to the village my grandma and grandpa came from. But my parents say, no, it's too dangerous. It's up in the mountains. It's way up there, and you don't speak Greek. And so I contradicted her parents. I said, go. She came back, and she told me this story. I rode the bus, and the bus didn't go to the village. It stopped on the highway, and there was a road. And somebody spoke English on the bus. They said, that's the village, it's up there. So I got out and I started walking up towards the village, and it was a long walk, and then I really got frightened. I didn't know what to do. And then as I got closer, I said I should have listened to my parents. And I came in and into the village, and a young man sauntered up to me and spoke to me in Greek. And I said, I don't speak Greek, I speak English? And then he just rolled me over with Greek, and I picked out my passport and showed him, American! And then he saw the name of my last name. And I forget what it was, but he screamed at it, oh my God. And he babbled, I got the message that I was to stay there. And so I stood there, and he ran away, and then I saw little clusters of people. The rumor was going around that I was there. They never came close. 2 or 3 would stand over there, and down there, and down there. And after what seemed like a horrible long time, all of a sudden I heard noise, and there was a group of people, men and women, that were coming towards me, and the boy was with them. And he came up to me, and he pointed his finger, and he said something in Greek, and somewhere in the crowd, a translation came. He said, is your name? And then he named the family name. And he said, this was what happened. She said that the translation always came from somewhere, but he said, your grandfather and grandmother, they left this village and they never came back. Your mother and father were born and raised in this village. They left this village and they never came back. And she said this very dramatically, that always the translation was coming in English after the people had all, and then he said something really loud. I get emotional telling it. And she said, then all of a sudden, all of the people started making the sign of the cross, and the translation came. But you, my daughter, you have come back. This is your home. This is your family. Welcome. And he grabbed a hold of me and kissed me. And so this is what I pray for everyone who has to find their roots and to have the embrace of their heritage. And I can get melodramatic about it. It's still hard to tell it without crying. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It is emotional. And I think it's a message that comes at a time where we all need to think about that. So thank you for sharing your books and illustrations with us at the Thomas St. Angelo Library. And thank you for coming out on a terrible, windy, cold January day. Happy birthday.
Thank you for giving me the chance to share. And to all the people watching, go find your roots, find your home, find your peace, find your thing. God bless. Thank you.